Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Oxygène by Jean-Michel Jarre.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So yeah, today's album is a pretty well-known one, and not only in the cult of progressive rock, and honestly for a good reason, and I expect that a lot of you watching this video right now probably already know this album, but for me it's the first time and honestly it was pretty great. So let's get right into it with some of my favorite bits from this album. This album today is one that I wanted to get to for so long now. This is pretty much an underground album, but in the oddest sense ever, because it's not an obscure album, it's just one that people don't seem to be ranting and raving about and talking about all the time, and instead it just pops out every now and then in best albums lists and in the background of other people's YouTube videos. It just always seems to be there without ever really shouting out its name. But despite me being subconsciously exposed to this album for maybe years now, I've never even gotten close to realizing what it might actually sound like. And as far as I'm concerned, this album could have easily been something like symphonic prog or psychedelic rock or French avant-garde. I honestly wouldn't know. So when it finally came time to listen to this one, I did not want to go into it just blindly. I wanted to know a bit about it, so I went ahead and did some research about the person who created this one and about the album itself, and of course today we're talking about no other than Oxygène by Jean-Michel Jarre, and well, he has a pretty interesting story behind him. So Jean-Michel Jarre was born in 1948 to a Jewish descendant family, and his father Franchet Pigeon was actually a resistance fighter as well as a concentration camp survivor during the Holocaust. Though after Jarre was born at the age of 5, his father immigrated to the US, and thus Jarre never saw him, at least not until the age of 18, and in that time in his childhood he would mostly live with his mother as well as spending extensive months upon end with his maternal grandparents. Now growing up, Jarre would live in Lyon, France, and he would be exposed to music in many different ways. Firstly from his grandfather, who was an oboe player himself, and his apartment overseeing a lot of street performance which he would hear on a daily basis. And at a young age, Jarre would start learning piano, and he would specifically learn how to play classical piano, a process which he at first did not enjoy that fondly, but after his teacher was substituted, he suddenly started enjoying the act much more. Now, one of the real breakthrough in Jarre's life had to be when his grandfather bought him a tape recorder, which would enable him to record his own music, as well as play around with the possibilities of creating music via recording. And while growing up, Jarre was not only a musician, but he also knew how to paint, and he would go around painting paintings and selling them for a living. Now in the year of 1967, Jarre would join a band called The Dustbins, which, despite the fact that he was already a part of several bands by this point as a guitarist and as a flautist and as a keyboardist, this one would be a bit more notable because these ones actually were able to get some successful projects out there, mainly in the form of film scores. And in 1969, Jean would make what is probably the most decisive and impactful decision of his entire life when he joined a group called Groupe de Recherche Musicale, which basically means Group for Musical Research. And this group was founded and led by no other than the inventor of musique concrète himself, Pierre Schaeffer. And from Schaeffer, Jarre would learn so many things, especially the use of recorded media as a means of creating music. And he would be exposed to many instruments and techniques and synthesizers, especially the Moog modular synthesizer, which he would use to start off his own studio in his house's own kitchen, where he would record his initial materials. Now, between the years of 1970 and 1975, Jarre would basically gain experience in the most sincere way, and that's experimentation and, well, experience itself. In this time, he would compose scores for ballets, for television, and for theater, as well as create jingles for commercials for Pepsi and even Nestle. And in the year of 1973, Jarre would come out with his debut solo album called Deserted Place, again created in his home kitchen studio. And then the same year would follow it up with yet another album, which this time was a film score for a French film called The Burned Barns. Now, in that time, Jarre would also become obsessed with purchasing various synthesizers and keyboards in order to add to his own studio collection. He started off, of course, in 1976 when he sold his own electric guitar to purchase an EMS VCS3 for his home studio, but then he would of course go on to purchase things like the Farfisa organ or the EMS Synthi AKS or even the Revox B77. In this time he would also discover an old Mellotron and repair it and put it back to use and of course use it, as well as so many other instruments all in his freaking kitchen. But slowly but surely, in the summer of 1976, Jarre would start working on his third studio album, again in his home kitchen. I can't stop saying it, it makes me laugh every single time. And this one would be a major commitment to him, and he would go to lengths that no other synthesizer user has ever gone before, and he would create something literally unheard of. Now, to understand the lengths in which he went with filterization, modulation, and synthesization, you must understand that a lot of the things that you would hear on this album would not be what you think they really are. There are certain instruments on here like the Farfisa organ which have gone through so many filterings and modularizations that you can literally not tell what the original instrument was because everything is so goddamn altered. Now, after a tedious process of trial and error, rinse and repeat, after about 4 months of work, Jarre finally had his final album. And this would be, well, a gamble because this one was unlike anything that anyone has ever heard. And if you had to try and describe it, you'd say something along the lines of a blend of Tangerine Dream and Wendy Carlos all put together with some Tubular Bell Mike Oldfields type shit. And honestly, it was so experimental, which it probably just had to be a gamble deemed to failure. But alas, in December of 1976, the world saw the release of Jean-Michel Jarre's third studio album called Oxygène. And firstly, this album only got a French release, but around March of 1977 it was picked up by the Polydor Records from the UK, who decided to release this one internationally. And while at first critics were a bit skeptical and even quite slandering towards this album, it seems like time has just literally done its thing, because many people would come back and say that, well, while they did not really understand what this album was, they knew that it had some intrinsic qualities to it that made it highly appealing. And well, it was not only critics that liked this one, because the mass populace of people also seemed to take really fondly of this album, which was, as I said, created in the kitchen of just one French dude, but people really loved this. Now, for anyone who actually does not know what this album is about, here's a bit of a context wrap up. So this album is around about 39 minutes in length, you know, the usual LP stuff. And well, it's one of the prime examples of earlier electronic music being done in a way that is mostly accessible for many people. With it having just only one piece divided up into 6 parts, we have the second and fourth part, which were released as singles, and well, specifically the fourth part is probably one of the best known electronic pieces to ever exist. Now personally, I was simply amazed by this album when I listened to it for the first time just yesterday. Despite the fact that it's one piece that is divided into 6 parts, and despite the fact that I do feel like I have to listen to it in its entirety, I can definitely say that each piece of it holds on its own, and it's definitely serving a unique part in creating the sum that is bigger than its parts. Part 1 is the introduction. It sets you on this electronic shoreline of sorts, and it gets you right in the mood for this album, ready for what's to come. Part 2 of the album starts off with introducing a new beat led by no other than the bass, and this one also introduces a keyboard solo, which is something that has not been introduced yet, seeing as there were only drone sounds. Part 3 takes us back a bit, and it does introduce this gradual build up towards what is probably Part 4, which is the most well-known piece out of this entire album. This one is slightly inspired by Popcorn by Gershon Kingsley, which you all probably know, and now that you know this, you might even find some connections between the two. This one, to me at least, seems to feature the two main components of this album to be introduced by this point, and that's the droniness, the environmental sounds, as well as of course the rhythm and the solos themselves into one really cohesive and not too long piece. Part 5 is actually my favorite from this album, and I know that it's a pretty unpopular take, but I really like it. It feels to me like we are coming back mostly to Part 1, but this time we are well versed and well educated because we've gone through this entire journey, and now everything sounds just a bit more interesting. Part 6 is the conclusion. We basically walk back to the same electronic shore after this entire journey we've gone through. We lie on the sand as the waves carry us over, and honestly, when the music stops, you can't help but want to start replaying this journey again. So yeah, this album, it's really good. It's actually just great, but unfortunately it does have some flaws in it, but I don't feel like I'm really able to express what these flaws are, as I'm not really able to express what its upsides are as well. And yes, this is one of those albums which I truly think is a truly subjective album. So with that being said, while I personally really like this one, I would get why anyone just doesn't really find anything in it. So that's why I would really like to hear what you think about this album down in the comments. So one day in 1976, Jean-Michel Jarre was walking around Rue Bonaparte in Paris when he entered the Marquette Gallery to view the latest art exhibition in it. And as he walked along the halls of the exhibition, he suddenly noticed a painting called Oxygène, painted by Michel Granger. Jarre decided that he wanted to buy that painting that very day, and he went to the art director and told him to please contact the original painter Granger and tell him that Jarre wanted to speak with him. And on September 15th, the two men met, and Jarre told Granger that he wanted to use this painting as the cover for his latest album. And well, they had to do a bit of work on the background and the cropping of the image because they wanted it to fit the usual standards for an LP cover art. And so, as it happens, this painting was used as the cover art for Oxygène. And as you might have noticed, the original painting is called that way, and well, that was the inspiration for the name of the album. Jarre just found it to be very much fitting for the music of this one, as well as coinciding with his own beliefs about the effects that we as humans have on the globe, and well, he really liked the idea of putting the two together. And when asked later on, Granger would say that while this is his most well-known work to date, he doesn't feel like the painting really belongs to him anymore, and instead he thinks that this painting belongs to anyone who likes the music of Jean-Michel Jarre. And me, personally, I love the heck out of this one. This is such a great cover. So all in all, I think that the best description for this one would have to be that this album is the tubular bells of electronic music, and for that it's gonna get from me a quite very high rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to The World of Genius Hands by Moving Gelatin Plates. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.